My car sputtered, coughed, and died on a lonely stretch of Route 17. The kind of road where the stars feel closer than the nearest gas station. Rain hammered the windshield, blurring the world into a watercolor smear of gray and green. I was 25, broke, and running from a life that didn't fit me anymore until he showed up. His tow truck's lights slicing through the storm like a lifeline. I'd been driving for hours, fleeing a small-town Virginia life that felt like a cage. My name's Ethan Carter, and I'd spent years hiding who I was, hiding the truth that I was gay. That I'd never belong in a place where normal was the only acceptable way to breathe. That night, I was headed to nowhere, just chasing the horizon, when my old Chevy decided it was done carrying my secrets. The tow truck rumbled up behind me, its engine a low growl over the storm. I squinted through the rain, expecting some grizzled old man. But the guy who stepped out was different. He was maybe 30, broad-shouldered, with dark stubble shadowing a jaw that looked carved from stone. His leather jacket was slick with rain, and his eyes hazel, sharp, like they could see right through me, locked onto mine as he approached. "You okay?" he called, voice deep, steady, cutting through the chaos of the downpour. I nodded, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't name. "Car's dead," I managed, gesturing lamely at the Chevy. He introduced himself as Luke Ramsey, the tow truck driver who'd been patrolling these backroads for years. There was something about him, maybe the way his hands moved with quiet confidence as he hooked my car, or the way he glanced at me, like he knew more than he was letting on. He offered me a ride to his shop in Willow Creek, a speck of a town 10 miles out. I climbed into the cab of his truck, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and something warmer, like cedar. We didn't talk much at first, just the hum of the engine and the rain's steady drumbeat. But then he asked, "What's a guy like you doing out here, running from something?" I froze. How did he know? I mumbled something about needing a change, but his eyes flicked to me, and I swear they saw the truth I'd buried deep. "Takes one to know one," he said, a half smile tugging at his lips. My stomach flipped. Was he like me? The shop was a squat, cinderblock building with a flickering neon sign that read Ramsey's Auto. Inside, it was warm, cluttered with tools and the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. Luke tossed me a towel to dry off, his fingers brushing mine for a split second, enough to send a jolt through me. "Let's take a look at that car," he said, but his tone carried something heavier, like he was offering more than just a fix. As he worked, I watched him, the way his hands moved, sure and strong, over the engine, the way his brow furrowed, like he was solving a puzzle. He caught me staring and grinned, a slow, dangerous thing that made my chest tight. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, leaning against the Chevy, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," I admitted, "just passing through." But I didn't want to pass through. Not anymore. There was something about Luke, something that made me want to stay, to unravel whatever story was hidden behind those hazel eyes. He told me the car needed a new alternator, which would take a day to get. "You got a place to crash?" he asked. I didn't. My plan had been to sleep in the car, but I wasn't about to admit that. He studied me, then said, "There's a cot in the back. You can stay here tonight." I should have said no. I should have kept my distance. But something in his voice, in the way he looked at me like I wasn't just some stranded kid, made me nod. That night, lying on the creaky cot in the shop's back room, couldn't sleep. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but my mind was a storm. Luke was out there, just beyond the door, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this breakdown wasn't just about my car. It was about me, about him, about something bigger, something that scared me as much as it thrilled me. I didn't know it then, but that night on Route 17 was the start of everything. The start of a story that would break me open, piece by piece, and rebuild me into someone I didn't yet know I could be. The next morning, Willow Creek woke up under a sky bruised with clouds. I stirred on the cot, the smell of coffee pulling me from a restless sleep. Luke was already up, leaning against a workbench, sipping from a chipped mug. "Morning," he said, his voice rough like gravel, but warm, like he was glad I was still there. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the dream I'd had Luke's face. Too close, his breath warm against my cheek. "Coffee," he offered, holding out a mug. Our fingers brushed again as I took it, and I swear the air crackled. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice betraying the nerves twisting in my gut. I wasn't used to this feeling seen, feeling something for a guy I'd just met. Back home, I'd buried those feelings under years of pretending, of dating girls I didn't love, of dodging questions from my family. But here, in this greasy little shop, felt like the walls I'd built were crumbling. Luke didn't push. He just worked on my car, humming some old country tune, while I sat on a stool, pretending to read a dog-eared magazine. Every so often, he'd glance over, and I'd catch his eyes hazel, flecked with gold in the morning light. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said finally, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not much to say." I lied. Truth was, I had too much to say, but no idea how to start. He chuckled. "Low and easy. Fair enough. But you've got a story, Ethan. I can tell." That caught me off guard. My name sounded different in his mouth, like it carried weight. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, the shop's phone rang. Luke answered, his tone shifting to something clipped, guarded. "Yeah, I'll handle it, Ma," he said, then hung up, his jaw tight. "Everything okay?" I asked, surprising myself. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Family stuff. My mom's been sick. And my brother's, well, he's a mess. Always has been." I nodded, not pushing, but I saw the weight in his shoulders. The kind you carry when you're holding up more than just yourself. "You take care of them?" I asked. "Somebody's gotta," he said, and there was a flicker of something raw in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or exhaustion. The day passed in a blur of small talk and stolen glances. Luke worked on my car, explaining the alternator issue in a way that made me feel like he cared whether I understood. I told him bits and pieces about my life growing up in a town where everyone knew your business. Leaving college because I couldn't afford it. Driving west because I didn't know what else to do. I left out the part about being gay. But every time his hand brushed mine or his laugh filled the shop, I felt it clawing its way to the surface. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and Luke suggested we grab food at the diner across the street. The Willow Creek Diner was a time-capsulered vinyl booths, a jukebox that only played Elvis, and a waitress named Dot who called everyone Sugar. We slid into a booth, and I noticed the way Luke's knee bumped mine under the table. How he didn't pull away. "You ever think about leaving this place?" I asked, picking at my fries. He leaned back, his eyes distant. "Used to. Dreamed of driving out to California. Maybe starting over. But life's got a way of tying you down." I wanted to ask more about his dreams, his regrets, the way his voice softened when he talked about starting over. But then Dot came by, teasing Luke about being the town hero for fixing everyone's cars. He brushed it off, but I saw the pride in his smile. Back at the shop, the alternator arrived, and Luke got to work. I watched him, marveling at how someone could be so sure of themselves, so steady. "You're good at this," I said, gesturing at the car. He grinned, wiping his hands. "Been doing it since I was a kid. My dad owned this place before me." "Before?" I asked, sensing the weight in his pause. "He passed a few years back," Luke said, his voice quiet. "Left me the shop. And the bills." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting the silence sit between us. It wasn't awkward, though just heavy, like we were sharing something unspoken. That night, Luke offered me the cot again. "Can't have you sleeping in your car," he said, and I didn't argue. As I lay there, listening to the hum of the shop's fluorescent lights, I thought about how I'd ended up here, not just in Willow Creek, but in this moment, with this man who felt like a question I was desperate to answer. The next day, Luke's shop felt less like a pit stop and more like a place I didn't want to leave. The alternator was in, but Luke said the car needed a test drive to be sure. "Come with me," he said, tossing me the keys with a grin that made my pulse race. We drove out to the edge of Willow Creek, where the road stretched into fields of swaying grass. The Chevy hummed, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on Luke. The way his hands gripped the wheel, the way his laugh filled the cab when I admitted I'd never driven anything bigger than a sedan. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice warm, encouraging. We stopped at a clearing overlooking a river, the water glinting silver in the late afternoon sun. Luke leaned against the hood, staring out at the horizon. "This is my spot," he said. "Come here when I need to think." I joined him, our shoulders close enough to feel the heat of his arm. "What do you think about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Lately, you..." My breath caught. The world seemed to shrink to just us. The river, the fading light. I wanted to say something, to tell him I'd been thinking about him too, but fear clamped my throat shut. I'd spent so long hiding, so long running from who I was. "You don't have to say anything," Luke said, his voice soft but firm. "I see it, Ethan. I know what it's like to carry that weight." My eyes burned, and I looked away, afraid he'd see too much. But he reached out, his hand grazing my arm, and I didn't pull away. "I'm gay," I blurted, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. I've never said that out loud before. Luke didn't flinch. He just nodded, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I figured, takes one to know one. Remember? I stared at him, my heart hammering. "You're..." "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I am. Been out for a while." But it ain't easy around here. The air between us felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I wanted to ask how he did it, how he lived so openly in a place like this. But before I could, he stepped closer. "You're not alone, Ethan," he said, his hand finding mine, his fingers rough but gentle. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I didn't feel like I was wrong. I squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. And in that moment, I knew I was falling hard, fast, and without a safety net. We drove back to the shop in silence. But it was a good silence, the kind that holds more than words ever could. That night, Luke invited me to his Placia small apartment above the shop, cluttered with books and old records. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in Willow Creek, about coming out to his dad and losing him too soon after. I told him about my family, how they'd never understand, how I'd left because I couldn't keep pretending. As the night wore on, we sat closer, our knees touching, our voices low. "You ever think about staying somewhere?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine. I didn't. I admitted. "Not until now." He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Then, slowly, he leaned in, and I met him halfway. Our lips touched, soft at first, then hungry, desperate, like we'd both been waiting for this our whole lives. When we pulled back, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "Stay," he whispered, "just for a while." I nodded, my heart too full to speak. But even as I sank into the warmth of his arms, a part of me wondered how long this could last. I was a runaway, a nobody, and Luke was the anchor of this town. What place did I have in his world? The next few days in Willow Creek felt like a dream I didn't want to wake from. Luke and I fell into a rhythm, mornings in the shop, afternoons stealing moments by the river, nights tangled in each other's arms. I'd never known what it was to feel this alive, to feel like I belonged somewhere, with someone. But Willow Creek wasn't as quiet as it seemed. Word spread fast in a small town, and I started noticing the look-sharp glances from locals at the diner, whispers when we walked down the street. Luke brushed it off, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened when someone stared too long. One afternoon, while Luke was out on a tow job, his brother, Caleb, showed up at the shop. He was a wiry guy, maybe 28, with Luke's hazel eyes but none of his warmth. "So you're the stray Luke picked up," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. I bristled but kept my tone even. "I'm just passing through." "Better keep it that way," he snapped. "Luke's got enough on his plate without you dragging him down." I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't know me, but the truth stung. I was a runaway with nothing to my name, and Luke was carrying the weight of his family, his business, his town. What right did I have to complicate his life? When Luke got back, I didn't tell him about Caleb. I didn't want to add to his burdens. But that night, as we lay in his bed, his arms around me, I couldn't shake the doubt. "Luke," I whispered, "what are we doing?" He propped himself up, his eyes searching mine. "What do you mean?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "You've got a life here. I don't even know what I'm doing." He took my face in his hands, his touch firm but gentle. You're not just anything, Ethan. You're here. With me. That's enough for now. I wanted to believe him, but the whispers grew louder. At the diner, Dot's smile was tighter, and a guy at the counter muttered something about Luke's new friend. I felt like an outsider, a storm blowing through someone else's home. Then came the call that changed everything. Luke's mom had taken a turn for the worse, and he had to drive to the hospital an hour away. Come with me, he said, his voice raw with worry. I didn't hesitate. We drove through the night, the silence heavy with unspoken fears. At the hospital, I met his mom, a frail woman with Luke's eyes and a smile that lit up despite the tubes and monitors. She squeezed my hand and said, "You're good for him. I can see it." Her words hit me like a punch. I wanted to be good for him, but I didn't know how. When we left the hospital, Luke was quiet, his hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "She's not getting better," he said finally, his voice breaking. I reached for his hand, and he let me take it. "I'm here," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. Not just for now, but for as long as he'd let me stay. But when we got back to Willow Creek, Caleb was waiting at the shop, his face twisted with anger. "You're gonna ruin him," he spat at me. "This town doesn't need your kind stirring things up." Luke stepped between us, his voice low and dangerous. "Back off, Caleb. Ethan's not the problem." Caleb laughed, bitter and sharp. "You're gonna choose him over your own family, over this town." Luke didn't answer, but his hand found mine, and that was answer enough. Caleb stormed off, and I knew this wasn't over. The town was watching, judging, and I was the spark that could burn it all down. The tension in Willow Creek grew thicker, like fog you couldn't outrun. Luke and I tried to hold on to what we had, stealing moments in the shop or by the river. But the whispers turned to shouts. A brick shattered the shop's window one night. A note taped to it, "Fags don't belong here." Luke's face was stone as he swept up the glass. But I saw the hurt in his eyes. "This isn't your fault," he said. But I didn't believe him. I was the outsider, the one who'd brought this storm to his doorstep. I wanted to leave, to spare him the trouble. But every time I looked at him, his steady hands, his quiet strength, I couldn't. He was worth fighting for, even if I didn't know how. The next day, Dot pulled me aside at the diner. "Luke's been through enough," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If you care about him, you'll think about what staying means." Her words cut deep. I cared about him, God. I loved him, even if I hadn't said it yet. But was love enough when it came with bricks through windows and a town turning its back? That night, Luke found me packing my bag. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice raw. "I'm making it easier for you," I said, my throat tight. "This town hates me, Luke. They'll hate you too if I stay." He grabbed my bag, tossing it aside. "You don't get to decide that for me," he said, his eyes blazing. "I've spent my life doing what everyone else wanted. Not this time. Not with you." I broke, tears spilling over. "I don't want to ruin your life." "You're not," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You're the best thing in it." We stood there, holding each other, as the world outside seemed to fade. But the world didn't stay quiet. Caleb came back, this time with a couple of guys from town, their faces hard with hate. "You're tearing this family apart," Caleb yelled at Luke. "You're throwing everything away for him." Luke stood his ground, his voice steady. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing what matters." One of the guys lunged at Luke, and I acted on instinct, shoving him back. It was chaos, fists flying, shouts echoing through the shop. Luke took a hit to the jaw, and I felt it like it was my own. We managed to push them out, but not before Caleb spat. "You'll regret this, Luke." After they left, Luke and I sat on the shop floor, bruised and shaken. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Don't be," he said, his hand finding mine. "You're worth it." But as we cleaned up the shop, I couldn't shake the fear that this was only the beginning. The town was closing in, and I didn't know how much more Luke could take. The days that followed were a blur of tension and tenderness. Luke and I clung to each other, finding refuge in stolen kisses and quiet nights. But the town's anger was a shadow we couldn't escape. The shop's business slowed. People started taking their cars elsewhere, whispering about Luke's choices. His mom's condition worsened, and we spent more time at the hospital. Ellen was weaker, but her spirit was fierce. "Don't let them break you," she told us one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Love is worth fighting for." Her words stayed with me, but so did the guilt. Luke was losing everything: his business, his family, his place in this town because of me. I started looking for jobs online, thinking maybe I could find a way to help, to build something for us. But every rejection email felt like another door slamming shut. One night, Luke came home late, his face drawn. "Caleb's been talking to the bank," he said. "They're threatening to foreclose on the shop." My heart sank. "Because of me?" "No," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "It's just bad timing." I didn't believe him. I knew the truth. I was the spark that had set his world on fire. I wanted to fix it, to save him, but I didn't know how. The next day, I went to the diner, hoping to talk to Dot, to see if she could help smooth things over with the town. But when I got there, Caleb was waiting. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Luke's gonna lose everything if you don't." I wanted to argue, to tell him to back off, but his words hit too close to home. I thought about Luke's mom, the shop, the life he'd built. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe I was the problem. That night, I told Luke I was thinking about leaving. His face fell, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "Don't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I need you." "I need you too," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But I can't watch you lose everything because of me." He pulled me close, his arms shaking. "You're not making me lose anything. You're giving me a reason to fight." We made love that night, desperate and raw, like it was the last time. And in the back of my mind, I wondered if it was. The breaking point came faster than I expected. A fire broke out at the shop one night, a Molotov cocktail through the already broken window. Luke and I woke to the smell of smoke, the roar of flames. We barely got out before the fire consumed half the building. The fire department came, but the damage was done. The shop, Luke's dad's legacy. His lifeline was a charred skeleton. Luke stood in the street, watching it burn, his face blank with shock. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, and that hurt more than anything. The police called it arson, but no one was arrested. Everyone knew who did it, Caleb and his buddies, but there was no proof. The town turned a blind eye, and I felt the weight of their judgment crushing us. Luke's mom passed a week later. The hospital called in the middle of the night, and we drove there in silence, the air heavy with grief. At the funeral, Caleb wouldn't look at us, and the townspeople kept their distance. Luke held my hand, but I could feel him slipping away, buried under the weight of loss. "I can't do this anymore," he said one night, his voice hollow. "The shop's gone. Mom's gone. I've got nothing left." "You've got me," I said, but even I didn't believe it was enough. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "I love you, Ethan, but I don't know how to keep going." Those words broke me. I loved him too, more than I'd ever thought possible. But love wasn't enough to rebuild a life. I made a decision then, the hardest one I'd ever made. I had to leave, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't watch him drown. I wrote him a letter, pouring out everything: how he'd saved me, how he'd shown me what it meant to be brave, to be loved. I told him I was going to find a way to make things right, to build something for us, somewhere far from Willow Creek. I left it on his pillow and slipped out before dawn, my heart shattering with every step. 6 months later, I was in Seattle, working at a mechanic shop I'd found through a friend of a friend. I spent every day thinking about Luke, wondering if I'd made the right choice. I sent him letters, but he never replied. I didn't blame him. I'd left when he needed me most. But I didn't give up. I saved every penny, dreaming of a day when I could go back, when I could offer him something more than a broken heart. I took night classes, learning the trade Luke had loved, hoping to honor him in some small way. One day, a letter arrived, Luke's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. My hands trembled as I opened it. He'd left Willow Creek, sold what was left of the shop, and moved to Portland. He was starting over, just like he'd dreamed. "I miss you," he wrote. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder." I cried for the first time since I'd left. I wrote back, telling him everything: how I was building a life, how I wanted him in it. I didn't expect a response, but a week later, my phone rang. "Ethan," he said, his voice like coming home. "Can I see you?" I drove to Portland that weekend, my heart in my throat. When I saw him, standing outside a small garage he'd started, I ran to him. We collided, arms wrapping tight, tears mixing with laughter. "I'm sorry," I said, over and over. "I'm sorry too," he whispered. "But we're here now." We spent the day talking, rebuilding what we'd lost. Luke had changed. Grief had carved lines into his face, but his eyes still held that spark, that strength I'd fallen for. He told me about his new life, how he was finding his way, how he'd never stopped loving me. We didn't have all the answers. The world was still hard, still full of people who'd judge us. But we had each other. And as we stood in his garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and the promise of a new start. I knew we'd fight for it together. Love doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Luke and I were proof of that. We'd been pulled over by fate, pulled apart by fear, but what we pulled out next: hope, courage. Each other left us breathless and ready for whatever came next.